Today I want to talk about producing films on a limited budget, and I want to give you 3 ways you can really improve production value even on a limited budget. The first is probably the least obvious, but one of the things that is the most effective to make a film look like a bigger budget film. And believe it or not, it has nothing to do with the visual. It is audio. One of the biggest giveaways that a project is a low budget project is bad audio. So even on a limited budget, if you can hire someone who knows what they're doing while you're capturing audio on set, and then hire someone to do post-production audio at the end, it will really help make your project look like a bigger film. So oftentimes filmmakers get all caught up in the visuals and the cameras and all the cool little gadgets you can get for filming, and while that's awesome, one of the biggest determining factors of the professionality of a project is the sound. So get good audio, pay for a little bit of post-sound production, and let them clean up your audio so it sounds good in the end. The second thing that can really help a project look like a bigger budget film is finding good locations. You can film that scene in a junky basement with white walls and fluorescent lights, but it's never going to look good on camera. If you can rewrite that scene to happen at the abandoned windmill over in the next town and film it there, you have a visually much more interesting scene. So good audio, good locations, and then the last thing I'm going to say is good lighting. Even a little bit of lighting on a relatively low cost can make a big difference as to the overall professional look of a film. So having some good lights, which you can get some really nice Lowell Total lights from B&H for probably about $150 a light. Having 1 or 2 of those can give you most of what you need for probably a lot of drama type projects to have good lighting in your film. So those 3 things are things I'd recommend.
Hi everyone, I'm Koula Sossiadis Kazista.
And I'm Katina Sossiadis.
And we are the writers and directors of the movie Epiphany, and we're also sisters. Today our question is, what are some ways a Christian filmmaker on a limited budget can get their project, give their project a big budget feeling? So for us, we actually think that the casting had a lot to do with it. We wanted to make sure that we had very talented people, and we did a lot of research. We looked online and watched a lot of short films and looked at a lot of reels to find the perfect people that were not too high profile that they were out of our price range, but were still very talented. And we also had our producer who specializes in low budget filmmaking. She did all of our contracts, so we didn't really have a casting director per se. Katina and I did most of that ourselves with the help of our indie film producer, Jane Kosak.
Yes, so a lot of filmmaking and staying, under budget is all of the connections that we had prior to filming. And that really kind of saved us, like people that we had met while working. Both of us, Koula and myself, had worked in the film industry before, and meeting all of those people and having them to pull favors from, and especially when we were in Florida, having an equipment house that we knew of, that was very, very an integral part, because renting a crane is extremely expensive. What is it per day?
I don't even know.
I mean, it's extremely thousands and thousands of dollars. So having that connection to a crane, which we used the crane, I think about 3 or 4 times on Epiphany.
We did.
And it's quite costly. So having that, we were able to film a lot of our key scenes that make the film very, look very high budget. We also had a drone, I believe. That was something else too that was recommended to us.
And I think nowadays with drones, you can easily cover all of your landscape, just because of what they do, and they are costly, but I think it's much easier than before. I think that you had to rent a helicopter or something, which is crazy. So that definitely helped us. And then also, we shot in Tarpon Springs, Florida, and the location that we picked was very picturesque. So I think it made our film feel like much richer because of the atmosphere that was there. And also we tried to do a lot of filming outside so we could move quicker, even though the weather was kind of a looming thing for us. But when we got outside, we didn't have to take as long to light the.
And the other thing is, we did a lot of the locations ourselves. So we went down a month prior to shooting, and we formed, connections with the local people, and went out to each restaurant, went out to each location, introduced ourselves, said what we were doing, we told them what the subject matter was. So we got a lot of people in the town on our side, which is a lot of legwork, but it cut a whole, locations.
Yeah, they
department.
knew us more on like a personal level, so they were more apt to help us. And then also, I think just surrounding yourself with very good people, that people who have done this before, who have worked in the film business. As I said before, we relied very heavily on our independent film producer Jane, who works out of Los Angeles. She's done this many times. She's produced many small films like ours. So we kind of relied on her. It was our first feature film that we directed. So she kind of paved the way for us. If we didn't have her, I think Katina and I would have kind of been floundering a little bit, trying to find our way. But with Jane, she kind of kept us on track. So the fact that we had her behind us the whole time was essential.
And we had pretty big challenges. I mean, we had a beach scene, we had a war scene, we had a lot of scenes on the water. Yeah. So, trying to keep that all in rain, that's where Jane came in, booking all of that, staying, trying to form connections with the local people and trying to get better deals, from them.
And I think also when we were on set at the last minute, she would say to us, "Do you really need this scene? Because we have to cut something here." So it was very helpful to have her there talking through everything with us and what we really needed in the movie and what we could kind of live without.
And then we had other driving producers, like our producer Chelsea, who was out there advocating and, trying to get people, tell them, "Oh, hey, we're filming a movie, so would you kind of offer your car to us?" and things like that. So people behind you and behind the script is really important. Do we have anything else?
No, that's all.
Okay.
All right, we hope that helps you guys.
Yes.
Thank you
so
us.
much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Hi, my name is Nathan Blair. I own Kingdom Sight Studios out of Colorado. I have written, directed, or co-written at least, and directed 5 feature films. I was asked to discuss a topic that I'm very familiar with, and that is, what are some ways a Christian filmmaker on a limited budget, who hasn't been there, can give their project a big budget feeling? I think that's something that everybody struggles with. We find ourselves in a situation where none of us really have the budget that we would want. So how do we maximize it? How do we raise it past the budget? What are some of the things that we as filmmakers can do that would take our small budget and make it look much bigger, like you had more? And so I thought about this, and I was thinking, what are the 3 phases of film, and what are some of the things in there that I've learned that are big assets? So the first thing is in the pre-production process, which is finding great locations. there is something about having a great location that's bigger, more dynamic, more visually interesting, that brings that big budget feel to the film. For our film Sleeper Agent, I was in Pueblo, Colorado, which is about 3 hours away from Denver, and just very dynamic architecture, very Spanish feeling, but they had some really cool city and county buildings. And I literally walked into the mayor's office, talked to the secretary, and she said, "Oh, this would be great. Let's figure something out." She gave me a couple names. They met with me while I was there, and I was able to set up a location inside the city and county building that used to be the old courthouse, and it had this amazing room with pillars and a picture of the Lady of Justice up on the wall, and it looked great in daytime and nighttime. And they allowed us film there just as long as it was after business hours. It brought such a big budget feel to our small budget film, simply based on it looked great on camera. It was bigger. It was a good space. The bonus was it wasn't empty. There was a bunch of stuff in play that we didn't have to over set dress that one. So to me, too often what we do is we end up not cheating ourselves by settling on locations as opposed to going after really dynamic locations, really finding great locations to work with. And then with that, be flexible in your script. Unless it is absolutely mandatory and you're like, it has to be a pink building, be flexible. Allow yourself to explore what this location would look like. Go on a tech scout, go on a location scout, walk around with your script in hand and see how the story can morph to take advantage of that location. I do remember on our film Scion, we had to be in 2 cafes, and there's no way I was going to get a coffee shop and rent it out and then have it look full, because we had no budget for this stuff. We weren't going to have tons of extras. So I worked with the owners of the coffee shops. They were sympathetic to our cause, and they said, yeah, you can shoot during business hours. So what we did is we just strategically planned when to shoot, and we let the business operate as normal, and we just filmed. We picked a good section of the space and filmed in it while people were walking around, and it raised the budget value, the production value, because you had extras. It was really cool. So those are some of the location things that I always worked on, is making sure the location game is always raised. What's a bigger, more extreme version of my location that I have in the script? What's more dynamic? What's more visually interesting? The next one is in production is just lighting. It's probably the most important thing when it comes to giving a small budget film a big budget feel, is just lighting something dynamically. Can take $100 and make it look like $100,000, simply because they know how to position light or block light. I would say even playing with color. Don't just let everything be a daylight or a tungsten. Put a blue, put a green, put some different colors. Really embracing the shadow, creating high contrast, dynamic lighting setups. To me, just take that budget and make it look so much bigger. The next one is camera work. I just feel like the masters move their camera in so many unique, dynamic ways. And that's something that I'm always striving to do, is how do I create more movement in a shot? How do I be intentional with it? A huge moment happens to our main character. I want to push in, or I want to pull away, or I want to work my way through the space. There's something that just having a simple dolly shot, the camera dollying across, and I think that's one of those things where if you're putting camera movement, lighting a scene well, you're creating something more interesting, paying attention to the visuals, right? In the post-production, sound design. The more and more I do films, the more and more I work in this medium, the more I realize that I can spend tons of time creating amazing, beautiful visual, but if I don't if I don't match that with sound, it won't matter. Sound will pull your audience away in a heartbeat. And I think the more we focus on sound design, sound effects, ambient, Foley, really good crisp dialogue, those are the things that can take that small budget film and make it look bigger just because it sounds crisp, it sounds good. If you're thinking about how much money you have and you think, you know what, I'm gonna cheapen my sound design and do it myself, and you're not a sound mixer or an engineer, don't. That's one of those things where paying somebody to do that is totally worth the money. It'll make the biggest difference for you is how it sounds. And then along with that, a score. I think a lot of times we pick a song or we do a simple score and it's left alone, or we try and use soundtracks, songs from friends. And sometimes that's okay, but it doesn't give you that big budget feel that having a score composed specifically written for your film, what that can do. Certain beats in a film that I'm like, oh, I'd love for it to hit here. We can design that, and the audience can. Those are the differences in a small budget versus bigger budget. Big budgets, they have, Hans Zimmer in, a huge sound studio. Small budget, yeah, you've got somebody with some plugins, but if you've got a really good, talented composer and solid plugins, it can make the difference in your film just by making sure that the score is robust. I've watched films where the visuals are terrible, but the score is amazing, and you're going, I think they spent good money on this. I'm not sure, but it feels like it's bigger. The music can raise production value very easily just by having a great score. This is important. We always talk about it, but emphasizing it is something that I really want to go through. Have a great color and great grade. Really focusing on the color correction and the color grade. Being intentional. If you shoot it well, it's exposed properly, you've got some dynamic lighting, you've got contrast, making sure that it's color graded and corrected appropriately, man, what a difference it can make. It's a subtle thing because it's such a visual thing. If it looks great, people are going to assume it was. Whether you did it, whether you're throwing on a LUT that was $7 from someplace and you just were able to manipulate it enough, that's okay. Really focusing on that color, man, what a difference that can make. Weird one is a credit sequence. Having a great credit sequence and not just throwing up letters on a page. But instead really being intentional with the credit sequence and how those names get there and why they're there can really make a big difference. It can really add so much visual interest from something that feels, I just threw some names up there to it's a part of the film. Man, it can set a tone, it can raise the expectations. So credit sequence is another one of those things. So those are some of the things that stand out to me in terms of bringing a big budget feel to a small budget film.
This is John Bosley. To answer the question, what filmmakers can do to give their film a much bigger budget feel to it. First thing, I'm going to preface this thing by saying all these different tricks, techniques that can be used, you can't just do these things during production or quickly add them, after you've filmed. They really need to be used and planned within the pre-production stage in order to fully utilize the value of them. Okay, first thing I want to talk about is with pre-production. I think it's automatically necessary. You have to shot list, you have to do a storyboard and understand how you're going to film, because every shot isn't they're not like photographs. Every shot needs to connect with the next shot in the sequence. If you storyboard it, you'll have an understanding of how the whole sequence works, which saves you money because you don't waste time filming everything in a scene. You're specifically picking what works best to tell your story, have a very unique voice. For instance, with this scene you're filming with these characters, who should we be focusing on? How are we framing them up? A wider shot is an objective shot. The closer the shot, the more subjective the shot. So what are we saying by the shots we're filming it? If you're showing filming a low angle, it creates the impression that one character is slightly more powerful than the other character. If you're doing up angle, I mean, there's a bunch of different things you can do, and you have to study that. I would recommend for people to read the book shot by shot and understand how those shots correlate with how you feel a certain way and how they are in those sequences. But if you are more of a shot style director and not a coverage style director, you will save your budget and you'll have more of an effect. Every shot will count. It won't be just covering all the angles. Doing the whole master shot over the shoulder close-up, which is taught in a lot of these different seminars and workshops, that is okay to get away with saying that I finished the film, but it lacks artistic impact. And every shot does not have an impact at that point. At that point, you just covered all the bases. You didn't fail. You just weren't aiming for something that was much more impactful. So the shots that I would emphasize, the things that would create a much bigger feel to it. Obviously, we're talking about drone shots. But it's not about just doing drone shots. It's how they are connected in the sequence. That's why storyboarding is so important. When I did Angels Among Us, every single shot was storyboarded. Now we had to make some changes going into production, but every single shot was storyboarded, so I knew exactly how I wanted to do it. And I actually laid it out on a timeline and figured out how I was going to put it all together before we went out and we filmed it. So obviously drone shots have an effect. If you look at how we did Angels Among Us, there's a shot where the drone moves up away from our police detective character after his arm lands on the ground.
Started having pain in my chest. I'm laying there, and I'm just begging God to let me live.
See, it wasn't just a drone shot. I was creating an effect that created with that drone shot. Another one, look into renting a gimbal. You can rent them from places like Borrow Lenses. They have a Movi or a Ronin. You rent it. It's a gimbal. It's basically a Steadicam, but you don't put on a suit. You hold it with two arms. You can create that effect. If you film things in frame rate, once again, this has to do with how you're picking the shots. If you film things in frame rate, basically slow motion, you can create that suspenseful effect that you want. Another one is called scene extension. So basically, you're filming a scene. Let's say it was like a house, and you wanted to put it in a different setting. So you film that house, and then because you planned it this way, you extend the scene by adding in the other effects that now puts it into a bigger concept. Another issue is obviously green screen, but with green screen, you've got to do a lot of testing to see whether or not you have issues with the lighting. You got to look and talk to your VFX artist, or if you do it yourself, you got to figure out, well, am I going to deal with a lot of rotoscoping, cleaning up where it didn't work. The next one is called poor man's process, or front projection. I'd recommend to people going on YouTube watching the behind the scenes on the movie Oblivion. They did a bunch of they did front projection, and they used front projection on the TV show 24. They've used it probably on Lone Survivor with their car scenes. There's actually a ton of people now doing techniques on that. You just basically go on YouTube, type it in, rear projection or poor man's process. Basically, the idea is Hollywood will use a process trailer. They'll put the vehicle on a trailer. They'll tow it behind a truck. They have the whole thing set up with lights, etc. The problem is it's very costly. You got to get permits. And then if you make a mistake, you got to do the take over again. Multiple times, you got to keep going, backing up and over and again. Versus if you film all the footage beforehand, you can have it projected on a screen, and if you know what you're doing, you can create the effect that you're actually driving. But there's a lot of techniques to it. It has to do a lot with lighting, using the depth of field a certain way, etc. So it's not just something you can just slap together over a weekend and somehow you fix all your problems. You've got to actually do a lot of research. I think I spent about 3 months researching on the best techniques on how to do it. in order for us to actually create the effect. But it comes down to is the pre-production. If you plan it out, it will work. If you're just going to, on the day of the shoot, wing it, if you're just going to do coverage style directing where you're just doing master, over the shoulder, close up, you won't have the effect you need to actually make an impactful film. And that's really the key here, is making an impactful film. The other thing I would also say is, and they'll recommend this, you need to go into your locations and evaluate both with your director of photography and those involved with audio to listen to the sounds. How are we going to be dealing with background sounds? How are we going to light the scene? What are the problems we're going to be facing? So that way you're already moving into those situations and fixing them beforehand. Another cheat people have done when they've had to do ADR is they made sure, knowing they're going into a location that would have bad audio and they know they're going to have to replace the audio in post, is they make sure they cover a few extra shots, because when they go to do the ADR, they may not get the lineup just right, and the cheat may be that you need to cut away to reaction shots, so that way when things are out of sync with the new dialogue you recorded, that you're able to at least cover up the fact that it went out of sync. So it really comes down to is thinking beforehand, what are the solutions you can come up with to solve these problems, and shooting enough assets and shooting them in a way that it's going to work as a sequence. Whatever you do you got to think of it like a magic trick. Whatever you do, you've got to create the illusion that the audience doesn't realize that you've been cheating, because every film, they're cheating. Even Hollywood, they're cheating. They're finding ways to distract you from mistakes, because every movie has mistakes. But as long as they can entertain you, they don't notice all the little flaws that happen behind the scenes. You get away with things. So it comes down to is, number one, if you're not boring, the audience won't notice some of your flaws. Number two, make sure your audio is clean. And after it's clean, make sure you recorded enough ambient sounds, enough Foley sounds so you can create a full soundtrack so it sounds alive. That's one of the reasons why a Hollywood film feels a certain way, whereas you watch independent films and you hear the dialogue and everything else seems kind of empty because they don't have enough of the background. And let's say, for instance, you have a problem getting enough background noise. That's one of the extra benefits of having music, because sometimes music can kind of cover up where you'd want to have some sounds. I'm not saying I want to cover it up, but if you can create a soundtrack that actually pulls the audience into the sequence, you may not notice some of the sounds that you wanted to hear, but you don't need to hear them as much because that soundtrack has just caught your attention and pulled you right into the scene. The other one is to make sure you're mixing your music in such a way, your sound in such a way where the dialogue is slightly higher than your music and your sound effects. If your sound effects and your music are overpowering your dialogue, the audience starts to become very irritating. You have to make sure that all your levels are basically staying on the same amount. You don't want to have it where one scene everything's loud, the next scene everything's really quiet. I'm not saying like using quietness for sound, story effect. I'm saying where literally you can't hear anything in this one scene, and then the next scene you can hear it clean. You got to make sure everything basically sounds like it's on the same levels. So that's one of those benefits you'd actually have of hiring somebody who actually does your sound design at the end.